Did you know that after Moses' death, there was a battle between the archangel Michael and Satan over his body? But why did Satan fight so hard for something that was already dead? What did he want with Moses' body? And what does this have to do with our faith today? In this story filled with ancient Bible mysteries, we will uncover what was at stake and how this spiritual battle still affects our lives. What can we learn from our own spiritual battles? And how can we overcome the enemy? If you've ever felt attacked or lost hope in difficult moments, this revelation is for you. Stay until the end and discover how God always has control, even in the fiercest battles. And if you want to understand more about these powerful mysteries and apply these lessons to your life, subscribe to the channel now. Don't wait until tomorrow to transform your faith today. Moses was an ordinary man living a quiet life as a shepherd in the wilderness of Midian. However, his destiny changed unexpectedly when God spoke to him for the first time through a burning bush that blazed without being consumed. Moses was astonished, but the powerful voice from the fire called his name and revealed the divine plan. He would be the chosen one to free the Israelites from cruel oppression in Egypt. God said, "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt and heard their cry because of their oppressors. So I have come down to deliver them." The mission seemed impossible. Moses, hesitant, voiced his doubts. He was not eloquent, had no power, and no position. But God assured him that he would be with him every step of the way. As proof of his calling, God gave Moses miraculous signs, such as turning his staff into a serpent and the ability to turn the Nile's water into blood. Despite his fears, Moses accepted the challenge. With his brother Aaron as his spokesperson, Moses faced the mighty Pharaoh, firmly demanding, "Let my people go." However, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused. Then began the 10 plagues that struck Egypt, displaying the power of the God of Israel. Each plague was a direct blow to the Egyptian gods, culminating in the dreadful night of Passover, when the firstborn in every Egyptian household was taken. Only those who obeyed God, marking their doors with the blood of a lamb, were spared. After this tragedy, Pharaoh finally allowed the Israelites to leave. Moses led the Exodus, a moment of great deliverance, but also the beginning of a challenging journey. In the wilderness, God provided for his people, sending manna from heaven and water from rocks. On Mount Sinai, Moses ascended into God's presence to receive the 10 Commandments, written on stone tablets. These laws were not merely rules. They were a covenant, a divine guide for the chosen people to live in holiness and righteousness. The journey through the desert was long and full of challenges. The people of Israel, weary from wandering, often complained about their conditions. On one such occasion, the lack of water became unbearable, and the crowd turned against Moses and Aaron, demanding an immediate solution. The atmosphere was tense, filled with murmuring and frustration. God, in his patience, gave Moses clear instructions. He was to gather the people, lift his staff, and calmly speak to the rock so that water would flow abundantly for all. It was a moment to demonstrate trust in God and his provision, even in adversity. But Moses was frustrated. The constant rebellion and ingratitude of the people wore him down, and he allowed anger to take over. Instead of speaking to the rock as God had commanded, Moses raised his staff and struck the rock twice with force. Water gushed forth abundantly, quenching the thirst of the crowd and their livestock. But something greater had been compromised. Moses' action reflected disobedience. By striking the rock, he shifted focus from God's miracle and diverted the glory that should have been given to the Lord. Despite the seemingly positive outcome, God saw the lack of faith in this act. Then came the divine judgment. God declared that because Moses had not sanctified his name before the people, he would not enter the promised land. This decision was a devastating blow to the leader who had guided the people for so many years, enduring their criticism, challenges, and rebellion. This episode marked a pivotal moment in Moses' story. Even a man chosen by God, endowed with great responsibilities and privileges, showed that complete obedience is essential. The promised land would be seen from afar, but never stepped on by him. After leading the Israelites for decades, Moses reached the end of his journey. In the mountains of Moab, he climbed to the summit of Mount Nebo, following divine guidance. There, before his weary eyes, lay the promised land, a fertile and abundant place that God had promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The horizon unfolded as a glorious vision, and Moses took in every detail of the land he had longed to reach. In his compassion, God showed Moses the full expanse of the land that the people of Israel would inherit. From Gilead in the north to the southern reaches of Judah, including Jericho, the city of palms, the sight was majestic. It was a final gift, a grand farewell for the man who had dedicated his life to the divine mission. In that solitary place, far from human eyes, Moses died. Scripture states that he passed away peacefully at 120 years old, with his strength still intact and his eyes as clear as the day. Yet, in a unique and mysterious act, God himself took responsibility for his burial. God's act of burying Moses remains one of the great mysteries of the Bible. The exact location of Moses' burial was never revealed. No one has found his grave, and no monument marks the spot. This divine act of concealing Moses' tomb preserves his memory as a leader and prophet without allowing his burial site to become an object of worship. God's care in burying Moses reflects the respect and intimacy he shared with him. It was a fitting farewell for a man who spoke with God face to face, interceded for a rebellious people, and bore the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to choose between obeying God and following what seemed easier? Share your experience in the comments and inspire others. The death of Moses marked a unique moment in biblical history. After his burial, carried out by God himself, something extraordinary unfolded in the spiritual realms. In the book of Jude, a brief mention reveals a confrontation between the archangel Michael and Satan, waged over the body of Moses. A moment of tension that raises intriguing questions. Moses' body, buried in an unknown location, carried profound significance. Moses was not just a leader. He was the symbol of God's covenant with Israel, the man who saw divine glory and delivered the law to the people. His body could have become an object of veneration or, worse, idolatry. Satan, the accuser, might have used Moses' body to turn people's hearts away, creating a cult that would replace the true God. Michael, the defender of God's people, stood firmly against Satan. Instead of engaging in direct accusations, Michael declared, "The Lord rebuke you." This response reflects God's authority over all spiritual conflict, showing that victory belongs to the Lord. Satan's desire for Moses' body could also be tied to Moses' central role in the redemption plan. Moses had led the people to the edge of the promised land, a preview of the eternal rest promised to the faithful. Controlling Moses' body could have been part of a scheme to corrupt this message of hope. This mysterious episode highlights the intensity of the spiritual conflict behind human history. Every detail, even the destiny of a body, carries deep purpose in the divine plan. The spiritual battle over Moses' body went far beyond a simple dispute. Satan, cunning and aware of the impact Moses had on the history of God's people, had a specific goal: to prevent any miracle involving Moses from taking place. Moses was not just an earthly leader. His life and mission were deeply intertwined with God's redemptive plan. The possibility of God performing an extraordinary act, such as Moses' resurrection or his ascension to heaven, filled Satan with dread. He knew that such miracles would not only be glorious events, but also powerful symbols of God's power and hope for his people. Moses, who had already led the people to the edge of the promised land, could once again be used as a sign of divine power, pointing to something far greater. Satan, always seeking to distort and thwart God's purposes, tried to create a barrier. A miracle like the resurrection or ascension of Moses would serve as a powerful testimony to God's sovereignty, strengthening the people's faith and exposing the lies of the accuser. The great significance of Moses in God's plan made him a strategic target. His connection to the law, his faithful leadership, and his legacy as a prophet made him a symbol of God's covenant with Israel. Satan understood that any divine act related to Moses would reinforce trust in God's faithfulness and his promise of redemption. The battle over Moses' body was, therefore, a desperate attempt by Satan to contain God's glory and prevent the unfolding story from pointing to the fulfillment of divine plans. The story of the people of Israel is marked by great miracles and manifestations of God's presence. Yet, there was an evident weakness: their tendency toward idolatry. On multiple occasions, during their journey through the wilderness and even after entering the Promised Land, this vulnerability was exposed. Satan, ever observant, understood this weakness well and knew he could exploit it if Moses' body were found. Moses, a revered leader, was more than a man to Israel. He was the mediator between the people and God, the bearer of the law, and the guide of a nation delivered from slavery into freedom. To many, his figure symbolized the very presence of God. This perception, though rooted in respect, could easily be distorted into idolatry if his body were used as an object of worship. History showed that the people were quick to create idols. On one occasion, even in the presence of God's glory on Mount Sinai, they crafted a golden calf to worship, disregarding the God who had delivered them. The discovery of Moses' body, a leader of such significance, could have been even more tempting. A sacred tomb, a place of veneration, or even relics associated with him could become symbols of idolatry. Satan knew that by turning the people's focus towards something material, he could weaken their faith in the invisible, yet real presence of the true God. A burial site for Moses could become a focal point for worship that overshadowed the true purpose of his leadership: to point to God, not himself. The danger of idolatry was not just in worshiping an object or place, but in diverting the people's hearts from a direct relationship with God. Once their hearts turned toward an idol, their communion with God would be compromised, giving Satan more room to manipulate their actions and beliefs. If this video helped you understand how God works even in the smallest details, give it a like now and show that you value inspiring stories. Moses, though recognized as one of the greatest leaders in Israel's history, had a past marked by human flaws. Before his divine calling, he made a grave mistake. He killed an Egyptian who was mistreating a Hebrew, hiding the body in the sand to cover his actions. This impulsive and violent act forced Moses to flee to the wilderness of Midian, where he spent years as a shepherd, far from his land and people. Satan, the accuser, is a master at bringing past mistakes to light. The killing of the Egyptian was a blemish that could be used to question Moses' legitimacy as God's chosen leader. Accusing Moses before God was not just about unearthing his past. It was an attempt to undermine the confidence of the people of Israel and discredit the divine mission. Another episode Satan could use in his accusations was Moses' disobedience when he struck the rock to bring forth water instead of speaking to it as God had commanded. This mistake, though it provided water for the people, cost Moses his entry into the Promised Land. It was evidence of his humanity, but also his fallibility. These failures, however, were not unknown to God. Moses' story is proof that God does not choose the perfect, but equips the imperfect to fulfill his purpose. Satan understood that bringing these accusations was an attempt to weaken Moses' impact as an example of redemption and transformation. Moses' body, therefore, could become another tool in Satan's strategy. Using Moses' past to question his worthiness would cast doubt on God's faithfulness to forgive and restore. Every human flaw of Moses was an opportunity for the accuser, but also a testament to the divine power to turn weakness into strength. The conflict between Michael and Satan transcended any notion of physical force. It was a spiritual battle, a clash of authority and eternal purposes. Michael, as the archangel, was the leader of the heavenly hosts and defender of God's people. Yet even he, with all his honored position, did not act on his own. Before the accuser, Michael uttered a phrase full of meaning. "The Lord rebuke you." This statement was not just a defense. It was an affirmation of where supreme power resides. Michael knew that in the fight against Satan, it was not about his angelic strength, but the unquestionable authority of God. Satan, known as the adversary, is a cunning and relentless being, always seeking to challenge God's plan. In this encounter, his intent was to assert his influence over Moses' body, but Michael stood firm, refusing to allow the accuser to succeed in his attempt to discredit God's servant's legacy. The name of the Lord, invoked by Michael, represented the pinnacle of authority in the universe. No argument or force could equal the divine power. The phrase, "the Lord rebuke you," reflected Michael's complete reliance on God's sovereignty. The spiritual war was not just about Moses or his body, but about the principles that govern the cosmos. It was a reminder that even in the heavenly realms, God's authority is incontestable. Michael, in his leadership position among the angels, served as an example of submission to divine will, demonstrating that victory lies in acknowledging and fully trusting in the Lord. God's care in concealing Moses' body revealed more than a simple decision. It was part of a greater plan, filled with wisdom and purpose. Moses was not just a human leader, but a symbol of how God guides his people, even through adversity. His life, marked by miracles and divine revelations, had the potential to become a focus of undue veneration. God knew that if Moses' body were found, the temptation could arise to turn his grave into a place of worship. The people of Israel, often prone to straying, might create idols or monuments that would divert their focus from worshiping the one true God. Protecting Moses' body was protecting the essence of the message he represented, that all glory belongs to the Lord alone. Moses had fulfilled his mission. He led Israel from slavery to the edge of the Promised Land, mediated the covenant at Mount Sinai, and delivered the law. Yet, Israel's journey was not meant to end with Moses' memory, but to continue with trust in the God who had sustained and guided the nation. God's divine protection over Moses' body also reflected the sanctity of his purpose. That body belonged not only to a leader, but to a servant who spoke face-to-face with God, and his memory needed to remain undistorted. By preventing Satan from using Moses' body, God preserved the legacy of faith and obedience he left behind. Moses' story was meant to inspire, but never to become a barrier to genuine worship of the Lord. The battle for Moses' body came to an undeniable conclusion: God's victory. All of Satan's schemes, no matter how cunning, were insufficient to derail the divine plan. The sanctity of God's purpose prevailed, and Moses' body remained hidden, safeguarded by the one who governs all things. Satan, the accuser, sought to use his influence to tarnish Moses' legacy and discredit God's work. He wanted to turn a faithful servant into a distraction for Israel, shifting their worship towards something material and fleeting. Yet, divine authority triumphed. Michael, the archangel, declared, "The Lord rebuke you," and with that word, God's absolute power was revealed. This episode was not just about Moses' body. It was a demonstration of God's sovereign control over all that exists. Satan, rebellious and persistent, attempted to resist but could not disrupt the course of God's will. The preservation of Moses' body symbolized something greater: God's faithfulness in protecting his plans and his servants. It was a reminder that no force, no matter how dark or powerful it may seem, can overcome the Creator's power. This triumph was not just over Satan, but over everything he represents: deception, accusation, and chaos. Every attempt to deviate or destroy God's purpose was thwarted. The victory over Satan echoed not just in that moment, but as a reassurance that the divine plan will always prevail. Have you felt God's grace working in your life, even after making a mistake? Share in the comments how that moment impacted your faith. The danger Satan sought to create by claiming Moses' body serves as a powerful warning about the risks of diverting worship from its true purpose. Moses was an unparalleled leader, a man who saw God's glory and interceded for the people like few others in history. Yet, he was merely a servant, an instrument in the Creator's hands. Turning Moses or any other human into an object of worship would be a grave distortion of God's divine plan. True worship is not based on visible things like monuments, symbols, or figures of authority, but on the recognition that God alone is worthy of all honor and glory. Worshipping God means understanding that He is the creator and sustainer of all, the only one who offers redemption and eternal life. When worship is diverted to something or someone, the focus on a relationship with the Lord is lost, and there is a risk of falling into idolatrous practices. The people of Israel had faced such temptations before. In the wilderness, even after witnessing God's mighty miracles, they created a golden calf and said, "This is the God who brought us out of Egypt." These moments of weakness show how easily the heart can stray and why God repeatedly called His people back to true worship. The story of Moses, protected by God to the smallest detail, reinforces that no leader, no matter how great, should take the place of God in people's hearts. Moses pointed to something greater than himself, the God who called and empowered him. True worship is a total surrender to this God, recognizing that He is the beginning and the end above all things. Moses, despite being a leader chosen by God, was not immune to mistakes. His life was marked by moments of greatness, but also by human flaws. Even so, God's grace remained present at every stage of his journey. From the moment he was called in the wilderness, hearing God's voice from the burning bush, to his final days on the mountains of Moab, divine grace sustained him. When Moses made his most serious mistake, striking the rock instead of speaking to it as God had instructed, he faced the consequence of not entering the promised land. Even then, God did not abandon him. Instead, He allowed Moses to view the promised land from the summit of Mount Nebo, an act of compassion and honor. It was a gesture that demonstrated that even in the midst of consequences, divine grace remained intact. Moses' life is a testimony of how God uses imperfect people to accomplish His purposes. When Moses fled to Midian after killing the Egyptian, he might have thought his story was over. However, it was during that period of isolation that God prepared him to lead an entire nation. God's grace is not limited by human failures. It is constant and transforms mistakes into opportunities for growth and redemption. Every moment of Moses' journey, from his victories to his failures, serves as a reminder that God does not choose the perfect, but those willing to be shaped by His hands. The message that emerges from Moses' story is clear. Even when we fail, God's grace reaches us. It guides us, corrects us, and lifts us, ensuring that His purpose is fulfilled in our lives. The battle over Moses' body reveals a spiritual truth that transcends the specific episode. Satan never ceases in his efforts to derail God's purposes. From Eden to today, his tactics remain the same. He uses doubt, accusations, and temptations to weaken faith and divert focus from what truly matters: obedience and trust in God. The confrontation between Michael and Satan shows us that even in the face of such intense conflict, victory does not rest in human or angelic hands, but in dependence on God's power. Michael, the archangel, did not rely on his own strength, but invoked divine authority by saying, "The Lord rebuke you." This simple yet powerful phrase is a reminder that true power resides in God's name. Satan, the great accuser, seeks to exploit weaknesses and mistakes to make us feel unworthy of God's love. He tries to divert, distract, and make us believe we are incapable of staying on the path of righteousness. Yet the story of Moses, protected even in death, teaches us that God's faithfulness is greater than any accusation. Resisting Satan's temptations requires vigilance, prayer, and unwavering trust in God. Just as Michael stood firm, we can face daily battles with faith, knowing we are not alone. Each victory over temptation strengthens our relationship with God and reaffirms the power of His grace in our lives. The story of the battle for Moses' body invites us to reflect on how we face our own spiritual struggles. It is a call to trust in the Lord's strength, for in Him lies the victory. If you believe that true worship should always be directed to God, give this video a like and help this message reach more people. The story of Moses is a powerful example of how obedience to God can transform lives and impact generations. From the beginning, when God called him in the wilderness of Midian, Moses faced challenges that tested his faith and determination. Despite feeling inadequate and insecure, he responded to the call with obedience, becoming the leader who would guide Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Moses' obedience was not perfect. He had moments of weakness and error, such as when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, disobeying God's direct instruction. Yet, at his core, Moses was a man who sought to fulfill God's will, even in the face of external pressures and his own limitations. Every act of obedience brought the people of Israel closer to their promise, demonstrating that God's faithfulness is always greater than our failures. Obedience to God does not mean perfection, but a heart posture that recognizes his sovereignty and seeks his direction. Moses showed that even amidst doubts and challenges, listening to and following God's voice yields results far beyond what we can imagine. When he led the people through the Red Sea, when he interceded for Israel after the sin of the golden calf, or when he ascended Mount Sinai to receive the tablets of the law, each act of obedience revealed God's power in action. This story teaches that even when we fail, God offers grace and the opportunity to start anew if there is genuine repentance. Obedience not only draws us closer to God, but makes us instruments for his plans to unfold, impacting lives around us. The story of Moses and the battle for his body is more than an intriguing account. It is a powerful lesson about God's sovereignty and the assurance of his victory in our lives. Every detail in this narrative points to the greatness of God's plan and how he operates even in the most difficult and mysterious situations. Throughout Moses' life, seemingly insurmountable challenges arose. From his flight from Egypt to the constant complaints of the people in the wilderness, everything seemed to conspire against the mission given by God. Yet, in every obstacle, divine power and wisdom were revealed. The Red Sea parted before an approaching army. Water gushed from the rock in the midst of desperate thirst, and manna fell from heaven to sustain a hungry nation. These moments demonstrate that God not only leads but also guarantees victory at every step of the journey. The conflict over Moses' body, waged in the spiritual realm, reaffirms that no force, visible or invisible, can thwart God's purposes. Even when Satan tries to use schemes to derail or corrupt, divine sovereignty prevails. God, in his infinite wisdom, protected Moses' legacy, preserving the significance of his life as a testimony of faith and obedience. This story is a reminder that the ultimate victory always belongs to God. His plans never fail, his authority is unquestionable, and his love for us never wavers. Even in the most intense spiritual battles, we can trust in the strength of the Lord, who acts with wisdom and perfection. If this video touched your heart and gave you a new perspective on Moses' story and God's power, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep receiving life-changing messages. Comment on what impacted you the most, and give it a like to help this word go even further.